Erev Tov, everybody. It is Tuesday night, different night this week, and we're at our latest time of the year with Mincha Maariv being late, starting at 9, and we just have a few more weeks of our learning to get through Bamidbar. Um, and this week with Parshat Shlach, it's a very, very long Rabbi Foreman essay, so we're going to do some skimming. I think it's really Rabbi Foreman at his best. Um, Finding a intertextual connection, drawing it out to learn some lessons that both help shed light on the two stories that are interconnected and on our lives in a meaningful way. So I really enjoyed this. Some of these textual connections were ones I had noticed but never really delved into, and he does a great job of doing it. Again, in the interest of time, hoping to finish in about a half an hour. I'm gonna just sort of guide us through, do some skimming, go more quickly through the parts where he's kind of talking to the reader, inviting them along on the journey, and try to zero in on the textual connections that he's making. So let me share my screen. Thanks to everybody for being here on this late hour on a Tuesday night. Here we go. Shlach, and the essay is called The Spies. He begins by saying our Parsha tells the calamitous story of the spies, and first quotes what the spies' wrongdoing was. Vayotziu dibat haaretz asher taru ota el bnei Israel. They brought a disparaging report of the land that they had scouted to the children of Israel. And he just concludes a summary of the impact of this negative report that ultimately leads to the wandering for 40 years in the wilderness and the generational turnover. And then he wants to pose two questions. First, what exactly did the spies do wrong? Right? The text seems to suggest their sin lay in the bad report, but Moshe told them, go check out all parts of the land, hatovahi imra'ah, whether it's good or bad. So, how can they be faulted for giving a negative report? They were asked to check things out. They were calling it like they saw it. Not only that, a second question, one that Rashi touches on in the very beginning of the Parsha, why were these spies sent all together? Yes, in the version in Devarim, in which Moshe recounts it, he makes it seem like the people came to him to ask. But in our Parsha, in real time, it makes it clear that God is commanding them to do so. And he poses the question, why is this necessary? God's going to conquer the land on their behalf or in partnership with them. Spies seem superfluous to what's clearly a divine process which doesn't need any assistance. Why command people to send scouts? It seems like a total waste of time. And he says, there's been lots of interpretations of this, lots of analysis. These are the two questions. Again, question number one, what did the spies do wrong? Question number two, why were they even necessary? And he says, I want to answer this question by attuning ourselves to a series of hints given by the text itself, which will connect it to a sister narrative. And by setting up these links, the Torah is asking us to read the two stories together as a kind of commentary on one another, and then we'll be able to answer our questions. So he now brings us on the journey of finding that sister narrative. And as always, as he does, says, as you listen to this, think, where have I seen this before? And he first, part one, the spies brought back this bad report. It's called Diba Ta'aretz. The word Diba is very rare. Where else might it appear? Again, he wants to bury the lead a little bit, so he's trying to build us up to it. He notices another thing, unusual phrase. When they come back with their report, it says, Vayashivu otam davar. And the truth is, this notion of lahashiv davar, to bring back word, appears only one other place in the Chumash also, the same place as diba unusually appears. And now go all the way back to the command from the get-go, shalach lecha anashim, send these men for yourself. When else do we have an instruction from a superior to an inferior saying something about sending? We have lecha ve'eshlachacha, again, similar sounds, shlach lecha, lecha ve'eshlachacha. Who says that? Okay, he hasn't told us the answer yet. He's just setting us up. And then his fourth echo, he wants to point out, which I think is a really interesting one, much less textually sharp at the intertextual biblical level, but hints to us that Chazal were attuned to this connection, which is famously pointed out that the story of the spies here in Parshat Shlach, the spies are called Tarim, Tafresh, Latur et Haaretz. But we classically call this story in rabbinic parlance Chet HaMeraglim, the sin of the spies, not the scouts, the spies. And he says, why do the sages call it Chet HaMeraglim if the term Meraglim is never used? And isn't it curious that that same story that has Diba, it has Lahashiv Davar, and it has something connected to Shalach Lecha, also has a story about spies who are called Meraglim. And what is that story? It's the story of Yosef and his brothers. And he brings all the parallels, which are summarized in this chart. Okay, so we have the Yosef story, which begins with Vayave Yosef et dibatam ra'a el avihem. Yosef brought disparaging reports of his brothers to their father. Parallel to Vayotziu dibat haaretz asher taruota. They brought a disparaging report of the land that they had scouted. Not only is this an intertextual connection, but what Rabbi Foreman notes earlier, these are the only two places in the Chumash that the term diba is used. And then bringing back word, right after they have the disparaging report, it's summarized and described in our parsha as Vayashivu otam davar. They brought back word to them, and when number of psukim after Yosef brings disparaging reports of his brothers to his father sends him out to look after his or look upon his brothers. It says Lech na ra'eh, go see. And he puts an ellipsis here because he wants to save the rest of that pasuk for later part of the analysis. V'hashiveni davar, Yaakov says to Yosef, bring me back word. Same as vayashivu otam davar. That's number 2. And again, he says that lahashiv davar only appears twice in the Chumash in these two stories alone. Right? They're strong connections on their own, but especially when they are the two of them are the exclusive appearances, and in parallel, it strengthens the case. Then the Shlach Lecha of our Parsha and Lecha ve'eshlachacha, not unique hits, but still significant parallel. And then finally, the notion, now we've moved a little bit further out from pasuk to pasuk connections, but still I think it's a powerful point. Yosef, when his brothers finally come down to Mitzrayim, calls them Miraglim, you are spies. And the story of the scouts in our Parsha and Parshat Shlach, although never using the word Meraglim, is referred to by the sages, by Chazal, as Chet HaMeraglim. So he says, these resonances don't seem like isolated coincidences, but what should we make of them? What are they trying to teach us? All right, now we'll try to hew a little closer to his words and just do a little more skimming as needed to get through it all in time. In general, when the Torah offers an extensive series of parallels between stories, what it is really saying to us, I think, is that each story is meant to shed light on the other. How? Well, the parallels themselves are clues. They don't just establish connections, they help us understand what those connections mean. It's as if the text is saying, here, dear reader, are a whole bunch of data points that will help you understand how one story relates to the other. In the pages that follow, we're going to go through some of those data points together and try to discern what they are telling us. As we do that, a new picture of each story will begin to emerge. First of the Yosef story, then of the story of the spies. And as our view of each story gets somewhat reshaped, we may well find that some of the nagging difficulties in each story, remember we already named the nagging difficulties in our Parsha and Shlach, what did the scouts do wrong and why were they sent to begin with? The nagging difficulties in each story will begin to melt away and new understandings of these two stories will emerge. So we're going to start with the Yosef story. Diba. So this first thing that Yosef brings back, Dibatam ra'a el avihem. He says, okay, let's ponder what this is all about and play a game I like to call cast of characters. When two biblical stories seem to be connected, says Rabbi Foreman, we can ask, who in story A is the counterpart of whom in story B, right? We have this in rabbinic literature when we have a mashal, a parable that is used to illustrate a situation, and you say, okay, well, who in the parable, the prince and the king and the countryman, who do they match up to in our biblical story or in our halachic situation? So too here, we have two stories that are set up in parallel. How do they actually match up, and what does that teach us? In our case, we can ask, if in Genesis, Yosef is bringing back a dibah to his father, who is his parallel in the book of Numbers? Well, who brings back Diba there? The answer is the spies do. It seems that Yosef was acting as a spy. That might not seem like much of a revelation, but it is. It sheds new light on Yosef's actions early on in the story. Because imagine that you're unaware of these parallels with the story of the spies, and you just open up chapter 37 back in the book of Genesis and start reading. You might have just said to yourself, so here's Yosef. He brings those bad reports back about his brothers to dad. I guess he was just saying something not nice about them. Not a huge deal, right? But now the picture seems a little darker. The text seems to position Yosef as doing something more deliberate. He was actually spying on his own brothers. And that is troubling, because spying connotes probing and reporting back on the weaknesses of an enemy. Is the text implying then that Yosef was treating his brothers as if they were an enemy? Meaning, if we parallel the story of the spies in Bamidbar who were trying to check out, the land and bring back a report about it, and it was a bad report. So Yosef somehow, we're not anymore interpreting the story as, oh, it just happened to be he was hanging out with his brothers, they were doing something wrong, and he told dad about it. But rather, he was looking for something. He was trying to find a negative report to bring back. As if that weren't surprising enough, our little game of cast of characters has more surprises in store for us. For a bit later in the Yosef story, as tensions rise between his children, Yaakov chooses to send Yosef on a mission to check on his brothers, right? And that's where we have all the parallels. Lecha ve'eshlachacha lehem, v'hashiveni davar, shalach lecha, right? As those words spoken by Yaakov reappear in the story of the spies, Moshe, acting at God's behest, sends the spies with those words of shalach lecha. And when the spies come back with their report, they have Vayashivu otam davar. So let's apply this cast of characters game to Yaakov. In Numbers, Father in heaven, i.e. God, deliberately chose to send some spies. In Genesis, then, when Yaakov, an earthly father, chose to send Yosef to check on his brothers, right? This is stage 2 of the Genesis story. Stage 1 was Yosef bringing back a bad report from his hanging out with his brothers. Stage 2 is Yaakov then sending him to go see what was going on with the brothers and bring back a report. So in Genesis then, when Yaakov, an earthly father, chose to send Yosef to check on his brothers, was he deliberately choosing to send a spy too? If that's parallel to the story of the spies. Now, again, what's imperfectly parallel is that we're taking two accounts of Yosef spying and paralleling them in essence to the same account of the spies, but that's okay. What a troubling conclusion. At the height of a crisis in the family, with tensions between the brothers at a fever pitch, was Yaakov actually sending Yosef to spy on his brothers? Why in the world would he do that? How could that possibly have seemed like a good idea? It seems so strange. And in fact, I think I mentioned in Parsha class all the way back in Breshit that our Shabbat guest, that Shabbat of Parshat Vayeshev, was saying how deeply troubling he finds this moment in the Torah. How could Yaakov not have known? We know that he knew that things were tense between the brothers. He sends Yosef out to go see what was going on with his brothers. He knows he's sending him into a hostile territory. How could he do it? There is perhaps a way of making sense of these startling conclusions, and it comes to us via Rav Shimshon Raphael Hirsch. Let me introduce to you a view of Yaakov's actions that Hirsch would like us to consider. Okay, so he points out, we're going to summarize a little bit here, that Yaakov knew exactly what was going on. The Torah tells us already in the first Aliyah of Parshat Vayeshev, Vaikanu vo'achav va'aviv shamarat hadavar, the brothers were jealous of Yosef after his dreams, and his father kept the matter in mind. So Yaakov knows that there's, this tension, and yet he sends Yosef on this mission. How could it be? The answer maybe is that there's a way to spy within the family that's problematic, and there's a way that's healing and wonderful. Hirsch suggests that Yaakov was aiming for the latter when he sent Yosef on his mission. He's trying to send him to actually do something good, a good kind of spying. Okay, it's as if Yaakov was saying to Yosef, this thing you've been doing with your brothers, that in and of itself isn't problematic, looking at what they're doing, reporting on it. What's problematic is how you've been doing it. Don't look at your brothers as if they were a foe, as if there was some weakness in them that could be exploited. Instead, spy, use your powers of observation and your curiosity in a way that seeks to heal and make things better. Once we open our minds to such a possibility, we might be in a position to understand a quirk of language that shows up in Yaakov's instructions to Yosef when he asks him to check on his brothers. Yaakov tells him, Lech na're'eh et shalom achecha v'et shalom hatzon. Go check on the peace, the well-being, the welfare of your brothers and the welfare of the sheep. We are no strangers to the word shalom in the story, for right before this, We heard the tensions between Yosef and the brothers were so bad that lo yachalu dabero l'shalom. They couldn't speak in peace with Yosef. Maybe Yaakov's singling out of shalom twice in his instructions to Yosef wasn't coincidental. Maybe it's precisely the missing and elusive peace between Yosef and his brothers that Yaakov sends Yosef to seek out. That's Rav Hirsch's point, that maybe Yaakov was saying, use your powers of observation to bring peace. How? I'm skimming a little bit here, by inquiring after your welfare. Go ask, go see how they're doing in a way that's like looking at them to try to bring something good into the relationship. And it is here that we come to the difference between Yosef's prior acts of spying, where he brought dibah that was ra, bad, back to his father, and this new mission to go look on his brothers and seek their peace. And now Rabbi Foreman adds, I don't think it's coincidental that the Hebrew word root, shin lam and mem, doesn't only mean peace and welfare, it also means wholeness, shalem. Seeking someone's wholeness is worlds apart from bringing back bad reports about them. It's even worlds apart from bringing back good reports about them. Good and bad are judgmental words, right? That's what you do if you want to exploit a weakness in a foe. But then there's the kind of spying that you do for those you love or care about. That's about seeing the other as a whole and becoming attuned to how that whole is doing, WHOLE, and how perhaps you could help it flourish even more. Perhaps the directive to go seek the shalom of your brothers was a directive to stop finding aspects of your brothers that are bad and instead accept the whole of who they are as you seek to offer them your care. It's an idealistic mission. It's a tall order, and it goes horribly wrong. Yosef responds to his father's request that he go meet his brothers and seek their peace with a simple, solitary word. Here I am, hineni. It connotes readiness. I'm ready to do what you ask. But it doesn't get to even happen, Rabbi Foreman points out, because before Yosef even gets there, the brothers plot to kill him. So we imagine the scene. Yosef had brought back a bad report because he was spying on his brothers. Yaakov sends him and says, I'm sending you again, but this time be a spy for good. Try to look out for the good things in them, restore the relationship, and even more than that, go see shalom achecha ushalom hatzon. Don't just see the good, seek their wholeness and their welfare overall. Don't break them up into pieces and dissect, but try to encounter the whole brothers. And Yosef
It's
seems
like he's giving him a do-over.
totally, totally. And Yosef, it sounds like, based on the Hineni, if we're reading it this way, is ready to do it, but he doesn't get a chance because the brothers plot to kill him before he even gets there. How does that happen? So Rabbi Foreman points out to us, because it says, "Vayiruo tomerachok." They saw him from afar. Before he could even draw near, they had plotted to kill him, and they said, here comes that dreamer. Right? And the problem, of course, was that Yosef was far away. They didn't get a chance to encounter the Yosef that wanted to see their whole selves. They judged him from a distance. They came to their conclusion that when Yosef was still at a distance from them, before he even drew near, before he had a chance to say a word to them. In a certain kind of way, the brothers too were spying. Because what, after all, does one call it when you view something from afar and draw conclusions about it? That's intelligence gathering. Except the brothers were in this case doing an exceptionally poor job of it. They committed what for a spy is a cardinal sin. They allowed their preconceived beliefs to drive them into making a snap judgment about what they saw. They only saw Yosef from afar. What if they had allowed him to draw close before coming to conclusions? The reader is left to wonder, what would they have seen? Maybe they would have seen the whole of Yosef in all his complexity, instead of a little slice of him easily identified as good or bad. Okay? So we have the setup. He goes again on the mission from his father to do the do-over, as Debbie calls it, and he was ready to do it, but the brothers didn't give him a chance because they didn't let him get up close. They spied on him, they judged him from afar, and the whole story ensues. It's not for nothing then that many years later, when Yosef finally encounters his brothers again, when he recognizes them, but they do not recognize him, that he accuses them of all things of being spies, miraklimatem. We noted before that this choice of accusation seems random, almost inexplicable. These very brothers kidnapped him and sold him off as a slave. Yosef couldn't come up with anything better than spying to accuse them of? Except maybe that's how Yosef sees it. In his eyes, they really were spies. The last time he encountered them, they were doing exactly what spies do, watching his behavior and drawing conclusions about him. Only they were flawed versions of spies, just as Yosef himself had once been a flawed spy. They only saw what they let themselves see. Tati James, hang on 1 minute. They allowed preconceived notions to irreparably prejudice their perceptions of him. Looking back then on the events leading up to Yosef's sale, one detects a catastrophic series of failures, all of which revolve around a version of the same thing. First, Yosef spies on his brothers. His father seemingly recognizes this as a problem and seeks to rectify it, but that mission fails. Why? Because when the brothers catch sight of Yosef approaching from afar, they become the ones to assume the role of spies. It's almost as if spying within the family is a kind of primal scourge that haunts Yaakov's family. And the effect of that scourge is momentous. It catalyzes the first great exile of the incipient nation of Israel. For when the brothers see Yosef approach and tell each other, here comes that dreamer, it's then that they cast him into a pit. He's sold as a slave, goes down to Egypt, becomes the first Hebrew slave in Egypt, and he won't be the last. Soon, the entirety of Yaakov's family will be engulfed in the tragedy that becomes Egyptian slavery. Okay, we'll pause here for James's question. Go ahead.
Could Yikarev there be an emotional coming close?
Yes, it could be by Yeruo Tome Rachok. They saw him from a distance, means viewed him from like a sense of emotional estrangement.
And before he had a chance to like Mikarev them.
Yes, yes, before he was able to warm, draw near, connect again. Right. It could be that he was even
Right.
up close, but the emotional connection hadn't had a chance to form. Absolutely. I think that Karov and Rachok are very pregnant with meaning and symbolism, need not be read only as measures of geographic distance or physical distance. Absolutely. Okay. Now we're going to turn from story one to story two. All of this, I think, puts us in a position to reassess the story of the spies in the book of Numbers. In particular, it may help us answer that basic question that almost every reader of the story finds themselves wondering about. Why did God choose to have Israel send the spies at all? The answer may have something to do with the historical arc of tragedy that we've just charted. The issue of spying in the family of Israel, spying gone wrong, never really got fixed. It became the pernicious flaw that ultimately led to our departure from Canaan and exile into Egypt. And if that's the case, well, wouldn't it stand to reason that when Israel finally exits Egypt to make her way back to the land of Canaan, that somehow she would need to deal with this issue of spying in the family? We as a nation would need to come to some resolution of this issue that had plagued us so and led to our exile in the first place, right? This is a deep reading, right? It's not just, okay, we have a story in Breshit and we have this story in Bamidbar. The story in Breshit, the failures of spying led to going down to Egypt. Now we're coming out of Egypt and going back to the land. We have to deal with the spying issue. And so perhaps God ordained that Israel would have one more chance to redeem her difficult past, right? So we had, as Debbie pointed out, the do-over inside the Yosef story, and it didn't have a chance to succeed. So now we go from familial to national, and we say, okay, there's a national do-over to try to address the spying issue. And that is the connection between L'cha ve'ashlach alehem, come and I will send you to them, and Shalach L'cha Anashim. In these texts, God's language mirrors Jacob's directive to send Yosef to his brothers. In each story, perhaps, a father is sending a child to spy for redemptive purposes. They're trying to create a chance for children to right a terrible wrong, to learn how to use their powers of observation and curiosity in ways that heal, rather than in ways that harm. What I'm suggesting here is that the mission Yaakov sent Yosef on may well match up with the mission God sent the spies on. Just as Yaakov was apparently trying to redeem a previous ruinous act of spying gone wrong, maybe the divine motive for sending spies was something similar, to redeem previous acts of spying gone wrong. Which acts are we talking about? Why, the unresolved spying in the Yosef story, of course. That, after all, is how we got to Egypt in the first place. Now, at this point, I can imagine you perhaps scratching your head and thinking that something doesn't quite add up. You might say to yourself, look, I grant you that the Torah seems to compare on some level Yaakov's action in sending Yosef to spy on the brothers with God's action in sending the spies to scout the promised land. But at some point, the analogy seems to break down. How could God's directive to Israel to send spies to scout the land possibly redeem the sins of spying in the family that led to our exile in Egypt? The scouts in Bamidbar were spying on land. They weren't spying on family. That's a really good question, but maybe the question is itself the answer. Yes, of course the scouts are spying on land, but who says the promised land isn't a kind of family? And then the question here, of course, is the answer. Is land a thing or a being? And he says, the Torah looks at land a little differently than us moderns do. He goes on, we're going to skim this a little bit. He points out verbs like Shavata haaretz Shabbat la Hashem, the land shall rest, observe a Shabbat to Hashem. It's not just people that need a Shabbat from working the land needs a Shabbat, it needs its own rest. We come from the land, right? Hashem formed the original human, Adam, from the earth itself. The earth is one of our parents. Indeed, in creating man, God famously declared, and I never thought about this reading, I love this reading, Na'aseh Adam, let us make man. The classical commentators all struggle to identify who God was talking to when God said, let us, Na'aseh. Was it the angels? Was God talking to God's self using the royal we? Ramban's response, I never remember learning this, I love this. Ramban's response, though, is that God was talking to the land. God was saying, in effect, hey, land, let us, you and me, make man. I'll contribute the soul, you contribute the body, and we'll get a human being out of our collaboration. Really beautiful reading of Na'aseh Adam. God says to the earth, let us together create the human. Throughout human history, this intuition that land is somehow our collective parent has nagged at our collective consciousness. Consider, for example, the tug of nationalism, how people relate to their land, their country, not just as their home, but as the motherland or the fatherland. At some level, we really do intuit that land is part of the family, a really important part of our family. For at some deep level, not only do we come from land, but like a true parent, land continues to provide for us even after our inception. Land gives you what you need to eat. Land gives you shelter. Land takes care of you in all the ways your parents take care of you. For me, like nestled in this whole analysis about the scouts and about, the parallel to the Yosef story, this nugget is just so beautiful and so powerful. I don't know if he talks about this in Breshit. We haven't done Rabbi Foreman on Breshit, so I don't know, but I'm so happy we got it here. What then was our heavenly parent doing when God instructed us to send scouts to spy out the land? Well, God, one of the parents of our nation, was bringing us to meet another long lost parent of ours, our homeland, as it were, the land of Canaan. It's the home we used to be in before the sale of Yosef sent us careening down into slavery in Egypt. Now, centuries after that terrible debacle, we are poised to go back into that land. But what's the way to approach that precious land from which we had been estranged for so long? Are you going to just go into the land as if it were a thing, eat its fruit, and go and exploit it? No, you're not going to do that. You're going to send an advance party to get to know the land. You're going to do what you do whenever you first meet someone special you haven't seen in a long time. You're going to ask, how do you do? You're going to do what Yaakov once sent Yosef to do. You're going to inquire about the welfare, the shalom of your family. It's only right. Now, in the next section, again, I'm going to skim a little bit. He talks about the fact that, well, the land with the relationship with the land had been a little bit complicated. In the beginning of the wilderness journeys, Bnei Israel were like glorifying and kind of idolizing the land of Egypt, and they were criticizing the land of Canaan that they were going to go into. So they had like a messy relationship with this land that they were, anticipating. And in fact, while some of the language of the spies' mission looks like it's military reconnaissance to get ready to, prepare for war with the land, but look what else it says. See the land. Is it fat or lean? Are there trees or not? Take from the fruit of the land. What's that all about? It doesn't seem to be like a military preparation. It's actually about connecting to the land, feeling a sense of kinship with it, seeing it in its wholeness. What's the totality of the land like? The larger point of such a mission is to create connection. Say the spies come back with reports that the land seems parched. Well, if it needs water, you'd have to make plans to water it. You'd have to take care of it. That's what family does for family. You have to first see the whole of it, and then you can both appreciate it and see what you can do to be of assistance. After all, what in the end wouldn't you do for another precious member of your family? Your parent is parched and thirsty, and you won't pour them a drink? In the words of the early Chovevei Tzion, the lovers of Zion in the 19th century, Kach bonim et haaretz. This is how you build the land. It's a cry that is both loving and tenacious. You are there to serve, to do what you can to take care of the land that you love. You drain the swamps of the Chula Valley if that's what you have to do. Is it fun to battle the mosquitoes? No. But if the land was neglected, you do what you have to do to make it lush and fertile again. You take care of it. Maybe the spies were on a peace mission, as it were. In the long arc of history, it was a chance to redeem the scourge that brought us down to Egypt in the first place. But if so, now we take us back to remember, Yosef was on his way to see Shlom Achecha, Shlom Hatzon, the wholeness, the welfare of his brothers. and he was coming with that spirit, but he never got a chance because they didn't get close, and they spied on him, and everything went awry. And now here we are. God is sending Bnei Israel on this reconnection, see the wholeness, the totality of the land, but that mission went awry. Tragically, as happened when an earthly father sent Yosef, Yaakov sent Yosef to check on the welfare of his brothers, when Father in heaven later sent God's children to check in on a family member, the land, things went terribly wrong again. What went wrong? Dibah went wrong, a version of the same thing that went wrong the first time. The Torah used this word first to characterize the disparaging reports Yosef brought back about his brothers, and then the same unusual word to characterize the disparaging reports the spies brought about the land. One might be tempted to translate Dibah merely as a bad report, but it actually seems to be something more nuanced than that. After all, the spies had said a number of disappointing and daunting things about the land, and the Torah did not castigate those reports as Dibah. For example, they said the people who live in the land are brazen, the cities are walled and great, and we saw children of giants there. But that was not the Dibah. Only when it says, "Vayotziu dibat haaretz asher tarua tal bnei Israel lemor," the disparaging report, according to the Torah, is when they said, "The land which we passed through, Eretz ochelet yoshvehahi, is a land that devours its inhabitants." What was wrong with saying that that's the Dibah, the negative words? What was wrong with saying it's a land that devours its inhabitants? It's not that these are negative words. It's more than that. There's something bitter, even contemptuous about how these words come together. Dibah, I would suggest, isn't necessarily false. It's rather a choice to focus on only a partial truth, and then to render a verdict on something as if this partial truth were the whole. Dibah renders a scornful verdict on an entire thing based on an exaggerated, narrow perception of a certain small aspect of it. This is a subtle point, and it's worth taking a moment to ponder it just a bit. Now, again, we'll summarize. He talks about the idea of contempt or scorn as, something which is about breaking something into its parts, where the whole is less than the sum of the parts. Or rather, breaking someone apart into component pieces, where each piece, yes, is less than the sum of its parts. Or each whole is less than the sum of its parts, I guess, right? He talks about doing that with people, and this is a problem in marriages. When you break somebody into pieces and you focus on the pieces and you don't see the whole picture. This is what the spies' dibah is all about, he says. It's an intriguing accusation to say that the land devours its inhabitants. And again, here I think a sharp insight about our relationship with land. To some extent, the spies must have been right, because to some extent, all land devours its inhabitants. We don't like to dwell on it much, but the fact is we all die. And when we do, our bodies go back to the earth from where we once came. Is that bad? Not really. It's the way the gift of land works. It's a whole gift. It comes with a bargain. You nourish us with your fruits when we are alive, and after we are no longer, our flesh goes back to you, and we in turn nourish you, the earth. That's the bargain. Land of Israel contains the same bargain, but in a more concentrated way. For this is not any old land, it's God's land. On the one hand, the land has an uncommon capacity to nourish its inhabitants, right? But being God's land, it has unique sensitivities as well, right? We have the concern that you not do the wrong thing, velo takiha haaretz etchem, so that the land will not vomit you out, suggesting the land simply can't tolerate elevated levels of corruption. So if that's true, maybe the land on some level really could devour you. Maybe, like the spies reported, there really were children of giants there. But this is simply evidence of how the land could and should nourish its inhabitants. It can make them grow strong indeed. Somehow, the spies sensed something of this immense but also foreboding power of God's land. But instead of communicating the truth of the land as a whole, here is a land that lives in the shadow of the divine, and which has the gifts and challenges one might expect would come along with that. They spoke scornfully about a splintered out quality of the land. That had the effect of eclipsing everything else and, in effect, rendering a distorted verdict on the land. That was the crime of those words, a land that devours its inhabitants. In other words, they took a quality of this land, which is its intensity, its capacity to nourish strongly, but also its heightened sensitivity to people's behavior that makes it sort of intense in its relationship to people, and they focused on the negative instead of the holistic. The story of the spies really is, and therefore it was not shalom, it was not shalem. They didn't see the whole picture, and therefore it was a dibah. It was a negative report. The story of the spies really is the ultimate unresolved story. Spying within the family seems to have haunted the family of Israel, going all the way back to the inception of the original 12 tribes. It seems that Yaakov had attempted to redeem that flaw. Centuries later, God even seems to have attempted to redeem it. But alas, it seems like this flaw somehow continues to haunt us. And when I say us, I don't just mean us in some vague communal way. I mean us in a very direct personal way, too. Somehow, when we, as individuals, look at members of our own families, when we observe them and draw conclusions about them, when we size them up, we engage in a very tricky dance. On the one hand, we should see the truth about our loved ones in an unvarnished way. But there's a bargain that love asks of us. It asks us to see context, to see those we love as a whole person, not a collection of fragmented parts. This is a lesson that I personally learned the hard way. He talks about his marriage and a time where he was criticizing his wife about some small specific quality or thing. And she said, you can't take me apart into little puzzle pieces. I'm a whole person. Over the years, I've seen more and more how right she was about this. I think one of the things we all want most deeply in love is to be taken by another as a whole person. It is a hope we should seek to fulfill for those we love. It's a hope we want others to fulfill for us. In some mysterious way, we are who we are because of all parts of ourselves, even the ones that seem less savory when viewed in isolation. Not to see this is to misinterpret someone. And well, to misinterpret someone you meet in the street and never see again is a small tragedy. But to misinterpret your family, those you should love, that's a big tragedy. In love, we need to attune ourselves to the reality that those we are looking upon are unified beings. We don't really get the option of taking only the parts we think we want. Reconciling ourselves to that truth, I believe, is what turning our back on diba, right, on that breaking things apart and analyzing only something or giving too much weight to something not we know which is really part of a greater whole, that's the diba. Reconciling ourselves to that truth, I believe, is what turning our back on diba is all about. So, again, I think a really rich, powerful piece, focal point being the connection between Yosef's reports on his brothers and Yaakov sending him back out to the brothers to, reconcile, and Yosef being open to that, and then the brothers sort of spying on him. And that whole story of the failure through spying on families, within families, is the catalyst of going down to Egypt. And so on the way out of Egypt, we want to try to repair that by going on a spying mission. But the spying mission is meant spying on land, but the land is more than just land because we talked about the connection in which land is actually part of our family. And then the vision and the mission to see the land as a bigger picture, a whole. And the spies fail on that and do a diba. They take a piece of the land, its intensity, and focus only not just on its power to nourish, but on its kind of the dangers of its intensity. And that is a diba, and that's the failure. They didn't learn the lesson, and we are still trying to make that repair, to see each other as whole people, not to do diba, and to really look at shalom, shalem, of those we love and of the land and of our people. And that's his essay on Parshat Shlach. The addendum, which I didn't trouble Shuli to scan, but those who have the book, in the addendum he collects, apparently, I didn't get to look at it, some more connections between the Yosef story and the Scout story. So there's, even more to build on. At this late hour, any questions or comments before we wrap up?
I have a comment.
Please, Peter.
Well, I had a different view of this parsha. To me, it seemed like all-knowing Hashem knew very well what these spies will be coming back with, and he knew what the punishment will be for what they said. But I think the reason, perhaps, was that the people were not ready yet to ascend to the land. They were still had the mentality of slaves, and maybe they needed to have as you mentioned, a generational change. The way it's described, dropping the carcass, is not very nice, but a new generation needed to arise who could cross the Jordan River and conquer the land. Because also there were like 600,000 Israelites able to bear arms. who could stand up against them? How stupid were the Misraglim to assume that we couldn't overcome? 600,000, army. That nobody can stop that. But that's not the point. The point is that they probably weren't ready. They still had the slavery in back of their minds. And then the longer view also, which I'm reading Nachomi or listening to Nachomi, is that a few hundred years later, in Hamelech Shlomo's time, they started to slide back down into idolatry. The kings that followed Shlomo were pretty much allowing idolatry in the land. So things went from bad to worse. So I don't know what could Hashem have done to improve us to be more staying with our religion. Why couldn't we do that? I have a very hard time accepting the fact how quickly we slid down.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. I think the reading of the slave mentality is a very compelling and common reading of sort of what was going on here. And that reading sort of takes it as a foregone conclusion that it always had to be this way, and that in a way the 40 years wasn't so much a punishment as a consequence, a recognition that this generation couldn't do it.
Right.
I think you're right that this reading, in the same way that, to utilize the Yosef story as the parallel, in the same way that you look at the Yosef story and you say, okay, he put a lot on the word hineni, right? He would have us imagine that Yaakov is saying to Yosef, okay, forget the past, see the wholeness of your brothers, go out there and use your spying powers for the good. And Yosef says, okay. And we're sort of saying, like, what? They were at odds with each other. Yosef was immature, they were immature, they were just jealous and petty in all these different ways, however you want to read the tensions between Yosef and his brothers. And now you just mean to tell me that Yaakov says to him, like, come on, yeah, just do the right thing. And Yosef's ready to do the right thing, and he's reformed, and he's going out to his brothers, and they just don't see his genuine, contrition, etc. It's like it's a challenging read of the Breshit story, and I think the point is the same here. God is telling this nation, like, yes, you miss Egypt, and yes, you are critical of that land, but don't worry, just like, go see the land, connect with its wholeness, find its fruit, etc., etc. And like, and the people are going to be ready to do that, and indeed they're not ready to do it. They're not able to do it. So I think your point is absolutely very well taken. Yeah. Yeah. And in a way, it forces us to look back at the Yosef story and see how fanciful or unlikely Yosef's flip on a dime really could be. But who knows? Who knows? Yeah. All right. The hour is late, so thank you, Peter, for your thoughts. And just looking about next week, we are actually should be back to our regular time and place again. We'll be at 9 o'clock because of Mincha Marav time, but we should be back to Monday night this coming week, Monday the 15th, for Parshat Korach. So
okay, thank you.
Everybody a great rest of the week. And I actually saw my parents today, so they're here in New York, so they're not on the Zoom. But wishing a great rest of the week to all.
Thank you very much. Laila Tov.
Laila Tov. Laila Tov.
Thank you, Yeshkaya.
Bye.